Welcome to Deep Water Wednesday at Messiah Community Church. We're in for an exciting lesson tonight on the first kids. I'm glad everybody could join us. We are going to dig in deep to some parts of the book of Genesis, and it's going to be a fun time. So we're looking forward to it, looking forward to you being blessed by everything that the Lord brings to us tonight. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. Let's get our commercial in first.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. You're about to participate in a Bible study by Messiah Community Church. Welcome to Deep Water Wednesday. Feel free to add comments and to engage in the discussion. We'd love to hear what you...
All right, I got a little bit messed up there because I was in the middle of being in the picture and couldn't figure out how to get out of the picture. So
you have to say.
We look forward to having us all be in this picture. Now I'm in the picture, which is good, which is where I'm supposed to be. And we're going to have a really, really good discussion surrounding these first kids. And now people will say, what first kids we talking about? Well, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are some interesting characters. So as we get in, feel free to throw your 2 cents worth in. That's what this is all about. It's about all of us learning. And the book of Genesis is by far one of the most intriguing books in the entire Bible because everything begins there. Everything that you can think of that you are living out right now or have lived out or will live out can be found in the book of Genesis. Now people will say, well, how can that be? I mean, this book is like really, really old. And we somehow have lost microphone, I think. Oh no, we're good. So this book is like really, really old. So how in the world could it have everything, including stuff from 2022? Well, Solomon says, famously, there is nothing new under the sun. Nothing. And while it is true that there is nothing new under the sun, we can find just about everything that you want to find in the book of Genesis. So as we get started here, let me just, I've got a few people, I'm hoping that everybody can hear. The book of Genesis takes us through from the beginning of everything. And when people say the beginning of everything, what do you mean the beginning of everything? And it takes us all the way through present day and beyond. I was talking to a gentleman tonight who is a chemical engineer. And we were talking about the beginning of everything. And one of the things he told me is he's really, really big into scriptural things. And he is into carbon-14 dating and all of that sort of thing, trying to prove out the cosmos, basically. And he was telling me about a book he had read where the guy basically proves that the Earth is not that old. And specifically, this guy proves out, and I wish I had the name of the book right now, but he proves out that all of the Earth had to have been formed with everything in it in a very short period of time, like 6 days. Makes a lot of sense to me, and it should make a lot of sense to everybody who is a believer, because this book takes us through all things that we know today, including why there's sickness and disease, why there's poverty, why there's the various different people out there who are detriments to society and those who are blessings to society. And we will see as we go along and get into Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel, all kinds of things that we will figure out as we go along. So we want to begin tonight with the first kids. This is a very important lesson for us to learn because these are the first people that really got everybody in trouble. or at least brought a bunch of really bad stuff into society. So let's take a look here. Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now the common translation says acquired, but the Hebrew indicates more like created or self-formed. The word for acquired is quanah, Q-A-N-A-H, meaning to erect or to create. Cain is kind of a play off of that name. It's Cain, and it means carries this sense of fixity. Now you say fixity. What do you mean fixity? Well, the state or quality is what the dictionary says of being fixed. So Cain carries the quality of being fixed, or the state of being fixed. Perhaps Eve, in having Cain, she thought that having a male child would fix the dilemma that they were in after Adam's sin. So she names Eve, Cain, this is going to fix everything, right? She names him as soon as he pops out. Only she is the one that fixes it instead of God giving grace. So she thinks she's fixing it. We get right to the works thing, right? What did I do to get myself out of this situation? What did I do to cover up my sin? Well, she's trying to fix it. God's given her grace. She's trying to fix it. It's human nature. We wonder where it came from? Eve. She continues to think wrongly. Now, if you go on down to verse number 2, it says, Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now, there is a large, I'm talking about magnificently large pool of scholars that imply that Cain and Abel were twins. Not identical, perhaps. The scripture doesn't say that she conceived again, and that's why I point out here in verse 2, it says, Then she bore again. It doesn't say she conceived again, she bore again. The Bible's pretty methodical about that it will do a, if it's going to tell you something, like somebody's having a child, it'll say they beget somebody, or they conceived and then bore. Well, it doesn't say that here. This is very similar language to Esau and Jacob. Eve actually, the Hebrew scholars believe that Eve had twins, but she'd never had a baby before. And so she didn't know, she didn't know if one was a twin, how many she had in there. The second time she bores, it says, this time his brother Abel. So it's the second time that she has Abel. Well, Abel is his name actually means vanity or empty. Perhaps she felt like her womb was empty after delivering Cain. Or maybe she felt like when Abel was born that having another kid, she just had one, having a second one is just vanity. It's kind of an extra. Abel, though, keeps sheep or grazes sheep while Cain does what his father does, and that's till the ground. So they have different meanings or different things that they do, different things they gravitate to. This is a real picture of works and grace. So while Cain becomes a tiller of the ground, Abel becomes a keeper of the sheep. By keeper of the sheep means a grazer. He wasn't doing anything. He's just watching the sheep and kind of keeping track of them. He's not really doing what Cain's doing. Cain's out there working by the sweat of his brow. It is a real picture of works and grace, which have, throughout Christianity and throughout Hebraism, they have been diabolically opposed to each other, so we understand from the New Testament. Genesis 4, 3 through 5. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat, and the Lord respected Abel and his offering. But he did not respect Cain and his offering, and Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. Now let's dissect this a little bit. Is this reference to the Shabbat, Sabbath day? It is thought that a blood sacrifice was offered in remembrance of God's grace in not killing both Adam and Eve. That's through many Hebrew writers. They were wondering why, Abel would have brought a lamb. The sons, Adam and Eve's sons, would have been familiar with whatever it was that their parents did. Adam and Eve obviously learned to sacrifice. There are several different real old-time Hebrew scholars like Hillel and rabbis that believe that Adam and Eve annually offered up a sacrifice to God. However they marked their seasons back then, that annually they came before the Lord, and this is written in a lot of the Talmud in that about how Adam and Eve came before the Lord and offered up a sacrifice on an annual basis, just like the book of the law talks about, because they were honoring God for his grace toward them and not killing them in the garden after they sinned. It's not inconceivable that Adam and Eve would have followed that same path. Now, it says, in the process of time. Well, this is a reference to a certain time period, and that's why they believe that there was like a Shabbat, a Sabbath day, when they all rested. And in the process of time, that this was in the process of time would have been at the end of a 6-day period. So in a rest period, they would have come, because this is talking about the end. Well, the end of what? This phrase, in the process of time, is not talking about an ongoing time frame or it just happened over time. This is actually referring to a time that then ended. There was some time period that came to an end, and then this event happens. There would certainly have been a 7th day of rest for them, because God taught them that. 6 days you work, the 7th day you rest. Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. Now, Cain clearly brings the offering of the sweat of his brow and the works of his hands. But that is, in the book of the law, that is a thank offering. A grain offering was a thank offering. It's not illegal. What Cain did, there was nothing illegal about what Cain did. People talk about, Cain sinned, he brought God this awful sacrifice. Well, no, it was not an awful sacrifice at all. It was actually a sacrifice that was legal according to the law. And so he brings that in to the Lord, and he offers it up. And even as we read through the book of Leviticus, we find out that God considers that a sweet-smelling savor. He's burning up this grain. And the veggies or whatever it was that he harvested, but it was the work of his own hands. It was the fruit of the ground. Abel brings the appropriate sacrifice of blood from the firstlings of his flock. The reason why that would have been a different kind of sacrifice, or an appropriate sacrifice, is because this was a time when they're coming before the Lord in regard to God's grace being poured out, God's rescue on them. The impression is that Cain comes with his works as almost a prideful presentation to God. Abel, however, brings something he never worked to produce. It was also our second enforcement of life being in the blood, and the atonement of sin being in the blood. So what Abel brings is an appropriate sacrifice, because that appropriate sacrifice is covering sin. The grain offering was a thank offering. to God, for his provision. It's not an atonement for sin. The reason why this is important to us is that Cain brings this, understanding that God requires the shedding of blood. Hebrews 9:22, and according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without shedding of blood, there's no remission. So they obviously had learned about sacrifice. I mean, how else would they have known about going to God and sacrificing? Sometimes we read with Western eyes, and we think of, oh, well, this is the first time anybody ever sacrificed. Well, in an Eastern culture, there's an assumption here that who he's writing to is an Eastern people, and they're going to fill in the blanks with, oh, this is a normal process. The whole language of the thing is not that this is the first time this is ever being done. The whole point of this is, well, yeah, they knew how to do the sacrifice. They had watched it being done. They had known about it being done. And so here we have Cain and Abel, and Cain brings, he is thankful, boastful about, hey, God, look here, look what I produced, and thank you for giving us the ground. But there's another note to have in this thing. Let me just go back to that for a minute. There is another note to have in this thing that I'll bring out, and that is that the conversation here isn't that Abel only brings the firstling of his flock and their fat. The conversation is that Abel also brings, and it's just understood in the Hebrew language, that Abel also is bringing the fruit of the ground. He is also bringing his thank offering, but he's also bringing this firstborn of the flock and of their fat. And I'll get to what it means when he says, and of their fat. Hebrews 11:3-4 says, by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts. You get that? God testifying of his gifts. Genesis tells us he brought one lamb, the firstling of his flock, and the fat thereof. But God testifies of his gifts. This is also in the Septuagint version, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, that Abel brought gifts to the Lord. The grain offering being one, the lamb being the other. So we can understand it's not right that we just come and thank God. We need the atonement. We can be thankful that there's a God in heaven, that he provides everything, that he is the ruler or the owner of cattle of 1,000 hills, and that he's the creator of all the universe. But until we have atonement, the thank offering is really mute. It says, and through it, he being dead still speaks. So Abel was able, even though Abel was able, you get that? Nice little pun? Oh boy, yeah. Abel was able because he understood that the forgiveness of sins was necessary, the atonement was necessary. Hebrews 11:5-6. Oh, let me go back there because I got a little note that I wrote to myself so I wouldn't forget this. Here there's three faith statements. The first deals with the faith of God to create from nothingness the worlds. By faith, we understand that the worlds were framed. Framed from what? From nothing. The second is the faith of Abel to know the answer to sin. The third faith statement is one about Enoch, knowing how to live a life after sin. So we put those in order. God creates it all. God sets the rules. God sets all the parameters for man to live by grace. God sets up how we redeem ourselves from our own sin, right? God sets all that up. So the first part is God, it's all God's. We can't get away from that. I don't care how much we think we own it, how much we think we're in charge of it, how much we think we can change, rearrange things. It's not ours. It's Lord's in the fullness thereof. That's the first faith statement in Hebrews 11. The second one is that Abel understands because he's a man, he has to make a sacrifice in order to atone for sin. So Abel is the statement about there's an atonement needed. Man sinned, man messed up this thing God made. Now there's an atonement for that sin. The third statement of faith comes in the next part. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. But without faith, it's impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. When God found a man who understood his grace by faith, God took him. Now, there's a huge message for all of us in that, and for everyone who believes. This statement is seen in the Cain and Abel story. It's seen exactly there. It's about living life through and by faith. It isn't just about, hey, I got life now. Hey, I have forgiveness now. Many believers live that way, right? Well, I'm forgiven. I mean, what else does God want? Well, what do you mean, what else does God want? Does he want more for your salvation? For you to have salvation? No. But what about the life part? What about the living part? What about living after salvation? And we don't talk about that much in church. It's one of those things that we're not allowed to talk about. We want to talk about telling people, don't sin, don't sin, don't sin. That was one message. The other part is get rich, get rich, get rich. That's another side of a message. But we don't talk about the balance of life. Okay, I recognize I'm a sinner. I need atonement. Oh yeah, by the way, Enoch lived by faith. Well, what does it mean that Enoch, by faith, Enoch was taken up and was not because God took him, because he obtained this testimony that he pleased God? Now, I know what I was taught in faith school. What I was taught in faith school is Enoch had this great big faith. Well, there isn't any place in the book of Genesis where it says Enoch had this great big faith. So what did Enoch have? Enoch pleased God, right? Well, yeah, you got to have faith to please God. No, you got to believe God. You got to believe God to live your life God's way. That's what Enoch had. If you go to the book of Enoch, in the many different parts there, and there are many people who say, the second Enoch and third Enoch, those weren't really written by Enoch. Probably not, honestly. But the first part we believe probably was. And God showed him magnificent things, or at least he was in a time when he knew magnificent things, and he yielded to God in his life to understand this thing. Listen, this thing about faith is not just believing something. It is believing into a life. It is living out something. I can say, I want a Mercedes, I want a Mercedes, I want a Mercedes, and believe that every time I turn around, I'm talking about the Mercedes being in my driveway. Well, for some people, that's their exercise of faith. I just keep talking about it as if it's real. And people say, well, you keep talking about it as if it's real. I met somebody one time, and I mentioned one little thing, and he about had a coronary on me because he said I just ruined everything else I'd ever believed. Because one time I said, well, I hope God would do something, Well, I hope God works this out for me. Well, you just ruined it all. You should have just spoke about it as it was. That's not faith. That's Norman Vincent Peale having a positive attitude. That's not faith. Faith is living out God. That's what it is. It's living out that you know there's a God. That's what Enoch did. And that's what this message of Hebrews, those 3 points, all those points can be found in the book of Genesis under the stories of Cain and Abel. Because Cain understood he needed to go to God. Abel understood he needed a sacrifice. Now, let's go to the next part of this thing. Genesis 4 through 5. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat, and the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. Why? Because he wasn't living out that relationship with God. He wasn't living it out. In Hebrews 11:4, we find it being said that God testifies, Abel brought a more suitable sacrifice than Cain. What was more suitable about it? It came along with his other gifts. He understood he had to thank God, but it was suitable because it was that time, that whatever that time frame was, that they would come and bring the sacrifice for atonement. Now, this implies, as many rabbis, that Abel didn't only bring the thank offering, but he brought the proper lamb for the sacrifice to atone for them. And it wasn't that Cain's sacrifice was bad. Abel's was just more than enough. It was better. Okay, where it says, Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. Well, in Hebrew, that "and" is not in there. So it really says, brought the firstborn of his flock of their fat. And what this is a description of, it's a description of the flock, the firstborn of the flock. The fat is a reference to the prime or the best part. So what Abel brought to him before there was any law, before there was anything written, Abel brought to him, to God, a pure sacrifice, the best lamb that he had. It was a pure lamb without blemish. And he brings it to him. And he offers it up. The lamb didn't deserve to die. The lamb had no reason for dying. The lamb was complete, pure, and innocent, and it was purely to be given to God. The blood sacrifice that God needed for the atonement of sin. In Genesis 4:5 through 7, let's go through this. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted?" Here we get into the life part. "And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." Why is a great question right here? God calls attention to Cain. This places Cain not in judgment or condemnation, but in a place of being taught. If Cain had faith in his sacrifice, then he did well or good, right? Well is yatab, meaning to be causatively, to make well, to be or to make well. So when he says here, if you do well, if you live well, if you make well, if when you come before me, you make well. This isn't talking about good. This is make well. If you have the flu and I give you a medicine that clears up the flu, I've made you well. You follow me? That's what Cain is doing. Or that's what God's telling Cain he can do. He could have made this well. Now, if your sacrifice makes you well, then you will be gazed upon, but you did not make your sin well, is what he's telling, God's telling Cain here. If you come to me and you have a sacrifice, and it's making well, if you do well, won't you be accepted? Won't you be gazed upon? He brought him a sacrifice. It was a good sacrifice. It just didn't make him well. In this, when it says that God had respect for Cain's sacrifice, for Abel's sacrifice, God gazed upon that sacrifice. He liked it. It was the proper. He took that. You know how he took it? Abel. you know what I require. Abel, you know what it takes for that sin, the sin that's in your life, the sin you were born with that you really didn't even have a choice over. The situation you're in, the flesh that's going to tend toward sin. You knew what was required for that. You understood that there was a blood sacrifice needed for that. That's really what God was doing when he gazed upon, or he gave respect to, Abel's sacrifice. But then God says to him, if you don't make well, the sin or the offense opportunity crouches at your door to spring upon you. Sin here is this sin or sin sacrifice is talked about is, it's lying at doors, crouching at the door. It's ready to spring on you. Like a mountain lion jumps on a rabbit. And it's almost like the sin has a life of its own, which makes sense since James tells us that when lust leads to sin, and when it's finished, as if sin has a power of its own. It has the ability to finish you off. When sin's finished, it brings forth death. Here it says, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Hey, Cain, buddy, this thing's coming for you. It's ready to crouch and pounce on you. You're a lot bigger than it. You should be able to rule over it. And sin has this longing for you. Once again, getting back to sin has kind of a life of its own. In other words, just not bringing the proper sacrifice was not the sin. But not correcting an attitude allows sin to pursue you. That's what allowed that to come in. That's what God's telling him. Hey, look, if you did well, you would heal this thing up. You would have healed this up. If you would have went to Abel, your brother, the keeper of the flock, and said, hey, you got a sacrifice for me over there that I could have? I know I haven't been keeping the sheep, but man, I want to bring something perfect before God because I understand what's required of him. How do you think this story would have gone then? See, he would have had an atonement for that attitude. As it was, he looks over at Abel and he's going, wait a minute, God, what are you doing respecting that? I mean, he didn't work for that. What do you mean? You're respecting him. You're gazing at him. You're gaga over Abel's sacrifice. God, why are you gaga over his sacrifice? He didn't work for that at all. That lamb was just frolicking around the ground. You know what people say about Christianity, right? Well, I don't understand it. You just think you can just rely upon Jesus and you're okay. Yeah, because I didn't do anything. It's not my works. It's his. He did it. He says here, or what you can draw out of this is that God tells Cain he is made to rule over his feelings, over his emotion, over his tendencies to blame, over his conviction, over bringing a consequence to himself because of his failure. Listen, God's telling Cain here everything that the scriptures tell us about grace. You can rule over. You can rule over all of this stuff. You can rule over that addiction. You can rule over that thing that you jump into. That's a good question. How did Abel know to give the first or the best when there was no instructions to do so? Well, first of all, we don't know that there was no instruction. What we know is Adam and Eve watched God make a sacrifice of an animal. Adam and Eve certainly were impacted by that because they lost their home. In Eastern culture, in this culture here, they don't have to say that. They don't have to say that, oh yeah, hey, Adam and Eve showed them what to do. All they need to do is tell what the next step was for these boys. It is understood in Eastern culture that there was something in between there. And the rabbis, a lot of the old rabbis, like if you've heard of Hillel or you've heard of Nicodemus, great inspirational rabbi. We know that Paul's mentor was really thought of. And all of these guys write extensively in the Mishnah, which is where the Hebrew priest and the rabbis and the the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they get together and they pour through Scripture and they beat the Scriptures up, and they come to an understanding of what God was telling about that particular story or that particular thing, and they draw on all the information they have from their families, their relatives, and so on and so forth. And in the Mishnah, it implies here that Adam and Eve did not have to, or they didn't have to say Cain and Abel taught them, because it was understood that they knew how to do that from their parents, or they knew how to do that from someone showing them how to do it. They wouldn't have just known to sacrifice that. They would have had to have been taught to sacrifice that. So in order not to make the story lengthy, just to get to it, we understood that. Well, Western culture, we like things spelled out. We want to know the details of the story, right? We don't want to have things just understood. But in Eastern culture, that's not how they relate, because they're going to the main facts of the story, and we leave the understood parts alone, because we don't need to rehash those. Well, you understood. If they brought a sacrifice, they brought that. They knew when it was time to offer up an offering unto the Lord. They wouldn't have known that any other way than if their parents had taught them, or if the people in the community taught them. So yeah, they bring it because they know this is what we do. We're a family that makes sacrifice to God because He's been good to us. He didn't kill us in the garden; He rescued us from the garden, and is allowing us another life. He's allowing us to produce children, to create life, to be and do what God had always intended for us to do, and that was create life, to be creative beings. They allowed us to do that. So yeah, we go to God and we do what God showed us to do. We offer a sacrifice for the atonement of our lives. And so what God is telling Cain right here is that your relationship with me has to rule over everything else. Your relationship with God has to rule over your emotions. It has to rule over your sin. It has to rule over your feelings. We have a tendency today, in this day and age, to have feelings and then lay blame for why we have feelings. Well, God says, my relationship with you has rule over all your blame, has rule over all your convictions, has rule over all the consequences, has rule over all your feelings and emotions. Quit getting hung up in that. And Genesis 4:8 says, now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. For a religious argument, it's pretty extreme, And it says here, this verse translated as if a conversation ensued their trip into the field, but all the best manuscripts never refer to a conversation. It's kind of like there was some conversation that ensued them going out into the field. Cain simply invites Abel into the field, and Abel goes with him. Maybe he said to him, hey, let's go out and try that sacrifice thing again. God really liked your sacrifice the other day. Now, there's no implied suspicions here that anything is wrong between them. It's not like Cain wasn't mad at Abel and they had a big spat. He simply, in jealousy and pride, saw God's look, God's gaze, God's wonderment, which is really what that is all talking about in that language there. God's wonderment that Abel comes and offers a sacrifice of the firstlings of his flock. There's no indication that Cain knew to violently kill his brother. And it's a total setup on the part of Cain to rid himself of his guilt and shame and not being found pleasing to God, although God never said he had anything against Cain. If you notice that when God speaks to Cain, he never says, Cain, you're guilty. I have this against you. God never says that. God says, hey, Cain, why is your countenance fallen? Why is your face down in the mud, Cain? Well, you gaze at Abel's sacrifice. Well, wait a minute. If you do well, or if you make well, won't you feel better? Won't you do better? But if you don't do well, sin's over there lying at your door. It's going to eat your lunch. It's going to take you into a place you don't want to go. We tell people that all the time. And they still fall, right? We tell people that all the time, and they still end up in the dumper. So they goes out, like most things we have against our brothers and sisters, they're all made up in their head. This was all made up in Cain's head. Abel wasn't mad at him. Abel wasn't trying to outdo him. Abel was just trying to do what God asked him to do. He was just trying to do what was required. Then the Lord said to Cain, where's Abel, your brother? He said, well, I don't know. Am I his keeper now? Come on, God. First of all, you're out there staring at... a little preacher ad in here, right? First of all, God, you're out there, you're staring at his sacrifice. I bring a good sacrifice, but you like his sacrifice better. I mean, and then you want to tell me, well, if I had done better with my sacrifice, I'd feel better about myself. Well, wait a minute. I sweated my butt off to bring you that sacrifice. That was a good sacrifice. My thank offering, my grain offering was a lot better than Abel's. And he said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. God knows what's going on with Cain and Abel. God, this isn't held in secret. It's never something that didn't, caught God by surprise. Like, oh, whoa, what happened? He's wanting Cain to own up here. This is the same exact language that God used with Adam and Eve when he went into the cool garden. He said, Adam, where are you? Come on, Adam. God has evidence that Cain's blood is spilled in the earth because the earth tells him. As much as Cain tried to blow God off, he couldn't. So God just finally asked the question, just like he did with Adam. Notice some modus operandi here, the way God does things. The speculation is that until this time, only animal blood had been spilled. This was kind of... read a little bit about this in one of the commentaries, that up until this time, there had been no human blood spilled in the earth. Only animal blood, sacrifices. And so man's blood hits the ground and the earth cries out. And that blood couldn't take away sin because it was sinful flesh. Perhaps Cain thought that he could spill better blood than that lamb. Maybe he thought to himself, he brought a lamb. What if I bring him? God wants blood. Let me give him blood. Certainly his brother's blood would have been more sufficient than that stupid lamb's blood. And so we see here this story. This story is a lot bigger if we get into it. We understand that this is the start of man's violence against man. This is the start of it. This is the beginning. The very first family, the brothers, I don't know what their last name was, but the brothers of Adam and Eve here, they come and they're already destroying each other. Look at 1 John 3:11 through 13. For this is the gospel message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Look at who's in here. Now this is the book of John, 1 John, the first epistle of John. Look what's built in here. Not like Cain, who was of the evil one and brutally murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his deeds were evil. But his brothers were righteous. Therefore, do not be surprised, brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. Why was Cain going to take it out on Abel? Because Abel did something wrong? No. Did Abel ever offend him? No. Abel didn't prance that lamb in there and go, ho ho, I'm going to get you today, big brother. You might have been born first, but I know how to sacrifice. I know what God wants. There is no indication here that Abel did anything like that. But 1 John implies here that Cain was always had evil in him. He always had that heart that was not righteous. But Abel is righteous because he doesn't count his own righteousness as enough. And that's really the point God was making to him. Listen, Cain, buddy, if you count your righteousness as enough, and you bring just your righteousness or what you think is righteous, what you think is right, what you think you can give me, sin's going to be knocking at your door, buddy. It's not going to be good. But if you bring the right thing, if you put aside your pride, if you don't think your righteousness is enough, if you, in fact, you know it's not enough, you know I require something more, and you bring it out of the humility of your heart, that's enough. That's enough. You'll be righteous. So the world hates those who rely upon God's grace. It's jealousy based in pride. Why wasn't my stuff good enough? I mean, you can see people doing that all the time. We see it in church. We see it, not in church. We see it out on the street. We see it on the, television shows. Why isn't my righteousness good enough? Why would I bring to God? Why is that never good enough? Why does God have this other thing that he wants? It's going to be the same way at the great white throne judgment. Jesus says over and over again, there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. People are going to be furious because they're going to come there. They're going to see how it's all laid out. All the universe is laid out. They're going to see the opportunities that they had. They're going to say, sin lied at my door because I didn't do well. Mine should have been good enough. No, God, no. They're going to gnash their teeth. They're going to clench their fists. They're going to wail because theirs is not good enough. That's the whole story of Abel. Abel knew what was good enough, not to him, but to God. What is good enough? What is good enough? What is good enough for God? Now we can say nothing. There isn't a thing good enough for God. Not one thing. That's the reason why we get up to right after the book of Malachi. In 400 years, God doesn't speak anymore through a prophet to Israel until John the Baptist comes along. And God begins to cry out, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Why? Because what God deemed good enough was coming. It was Jesus Christ. God was good enough. God was good enough. And so God's going to prove and make once and for all and make certain what is good enough. Genesis 4, 11 through 12. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. A fugitive and a wanderer. The question here really is, who cursed Cain? I know people say, well, God cursed Cain. And I taught that, honestly. God cursed Cain. It never says God cursed Cain. It says, and now you are cursed from the ground. The language there is that the ground is cursing him. He spilled something it was never supposed to receive. The blood of a man. He spilled it. And It's kind of like the earth can't forget that taste. You know what I mean? That's a different thing. The word for curse is orar, meaning to execrate. Literally, it means to abhor or to be made an abomination. It's the earth which swallowed in the blood of Cain, and it actually abhors having that taste in it. The earth doesn't want that. It was meant to bless us. It was meant to give to us the fruit of everything that comes up in the earth. It wasn't meant to receive the blood of men and soak it in. The earth is actually a living thing and part of the life of God. I mean, it's all God. The murder drove Cain from the thing he believed gave him value. He drove Cain. Yeah, God is still in control. There's no doubt God is in control of everything. But the natural process, the natural things of the planet, the atmosphere, the earth, everything, all of that, God has built into that a way of that everything is done. Listen, this thing was not meant to run on God pulling every lever. This thing was meant that God created it, God put it in order, God let it take off. Man was supposed to keep the earth, keep the garden. Man was supposed to do all that. Instead, we blew it. And so God steps in. But the earth knew it wasn't supposed to have human blood. Genesis 4:16. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod in the east of Eden. Cain's banished from being able to till the ground productively. He's made a wanderer and so leaves the place he's familiar with and those he's familiar with. He's not seeking God, however. Cain isn't out there looking for God. He's trying to duck. He spends his life seeking punishment for his sin instead of grasping God's grace. I mean, God gave him an opportunity, right, to fess up. What would God have done if he said, God, I got really mad and that sin just overtook me, just like you said. What do I do? And God would have said, you need to sacrifice that lamb. But the ground is still not going to like you, Cain. It's going to be a problem for you the rest of your days because you messed this up, just like your daddy did. He messed it up. Now he's paying a price. You messed it up. It's going to be a problem for you. You can only have redemption for the sin. You can't change the consequences of it. So he never repents of his unrighteous acts. Cain never does. And so he spends the rest of his life out there fleeing from the presence of the Lord. He goes to the land of Nod, which actually means wanderer. He begins his family. His family's filled with trash. His family's got a lot of problems. You think you got a problem, family? Listen, Cain's family was a problem. And he's the father of that spirit in the earth. The spirit that says, I'm guilty. I'm always going to be a sinner. I'm always going to run from God. I'm always going to... Not actually means vagrancy. You know what a vagrant is? Somebody taking up space in somebody else's field. You know, somebody else's porch. A vagrant, somebody is up to no good. A vagrant is somebody who's not making useful their life. That's what the Bible describes Cain as. Now, Genesis 4:25-26 says this. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God had appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. Now, Seth is a replacement of a righteous son of Eve for Eve. She says, hey, God's appointed another seed for me. Notice nobody here is talking about Cain as if Cain needs to be punished. We need to, string him up or whatever. The answer to that, there's a good question that just came online, and that is, did sin exist when Adam and Eve were made? The answer is no. Sin did not exist when they were made. Remember, sin is the present or the lack of the presence of faith. So whatever's without faith is sin. So what's faith? Believing God. So there was no sin until Adam and Eve didn't believe God. When they didn't believe God and they said, well, wait a minute here, that fruit is pretty good looking, and they partook of the fruit. That was sin. That was the first sin. That was the root of sin. It was strictly made out of pride. Now, was pride existent? Pride was existent in the devil, and that is this for the same reason. He didn't believe God, and that was just he tempted Adam and Eve right into that, and they fell for it. So Seth here is a replacement of the righteous son. Now, we don't know how much longer this occurs from Abel's murder. We don't know if it's right away. It's got to be soon after Abel's murder that a replacement here is given. But Seth is in the genealogy of Jesus, and Seth actually means substituted. So this is a substitute, another righteous son. By righteous, we just mean they believe God, and so they do what God says. It comes from a word meaning to place or to appoint. So Seth is appointed. The implication is that Seth was appointed to fill the place of Abel that Abel was taken from. Interestingly, Seth is only mentioned in the genealogies, has no other contributions whatsoever to anything else in the Bible. I know, he's the replacement, but he doesn't figure in anywhere else. Genesis 4:26, and for Seth, to him was born also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. Seth has a son named Enosh, literally a mortal. That's what Enosh's name means, a mortal. Then men began, is actually this time of beginning men. So this time or this frame is kind of starts a new era. Seth was a new beginning, separating those who called upon the name of the Lord or called themselves under the name of the Lord, and those who did not, such as Cain and his family. Now, this is an obvious segue to knowledge about everyone else born under Adam and Eve. There were sons and daughters born to them. Genesis 5:4. After he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. Now, the first family of man began with two and reproduced rapidly to thousands over the course of about 900 plus years. Now, since the whole purpose of them coming together was to procreate, numbers increased quickly, and families and tribes were born. Along with that, because of sin and the destruction of Abel, Cain's family took much of the dominance. The line of Seth is implied as only the line that stayed in a place of identification with God. They're in the minority. Cain's in the majority. Even they in the end are subdued by sin, and the only ones remaining up until we get to chapter 6 of the book of Genesis is Noah and his sons. Now, we must understand the laws that govern creation. Under sin, all things are moved toward death, not life. Christ was the cure for this dread disease. The disease of sin always goes toward death. That's what James tells us. It's always going to produce death. Christ comes along, and Christ reverses the curse. So now sin no longer is the death of everything. Yeah, it's the death of our mortal body while we're here in this earth, but it is the life, eternal life that God always intended for us to have. Sin does finish by bringing forth death, but Christ finishes by bringing forth life. And that's the first family. You want to know what the first family of Adam and Eve were like? Oh, boy. Look at your family now as we go through the holidays. Look at your family and say, man, I didn't make it out too bad. I don't have such a bad bunch here. Even Uncle Fester's a good guy. It's just how it is. And from the beginning, there was a destiny here that men were going to fall, and that's just what happened. So, listen, we appreciate you so much. Please do everything that you can to like and subscribe and give thumbs up or whatever it is. Spread the word on Facebook. Put the message out there so we can reach people with the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're going to continue next week. We will be up to Noah. Interesting stuff about Noah and his sons and the whole incident of the flood. There's a lot of information there that we don't normally hear in church, but there's some wonderful, beautiful stories if we'll just pay attention. So thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for joining us today. If you would like to support the ministry, go to messiahcommunity.org and click the donate button. Thank you.